Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. With me today, Mark DeSantis, Murray Dom, Mark McCaffrey, and Lindsay Powell. And our engineer is Angus Wallace of the History Network, doing the recording in quiet as always. Today, we're going to talk about some more walls. We did that last time, so we do it some more. Actual walls and fortifications, more like. Last time we talked about Hadrian's Wall, and now we're going to talk about the subject of the latest issue of Ancient Warfare Magazine, issue 15.4, which talked about the Saxon Shore forts, which is one of those wonderful examples where we have some really prominent leftovers, remains of something ancient, and it has a name, or at least we have a name for some of those fortifications. Well, if you read the issue, that's sort of the summary of what we know. They're there, but what exactly they're there for is something that occupied much of that issue and has occupied learned people for a long time. And I'm sure we'll try to do it some more today. Murray wrote an article in the issue about the only time the fortifications were, at least as far as we know, used as fortifications for defense, about 2 centuries after they were actually built. Let's try and can we give sort of a summary of what this system may have looked like without people needing a map, Murray?
Right. So at some point in the 3rd century, a number of forts were built on the east coast and southeast coast of Britain. They, we think, are part of a system, but then there are those these days who say that it's not a system. It's how dare you call it a system? And absolutely, they're known as the Saxon Shore forts. From one mention in Eutropius, who of course is a 4th century historian, he talks about Saxon raids infesting the seas and raiding the coasts of Gaul in the 280s, which people then extrapolate to say, well, they were probably raiding Britain as well. Hence, Saxon pirates, what we later know is called the Saxon Shore forts, were related to Saxon piracy raids. Then people point out that there's very little evidence other than this one sentence in Eutropius about Saxon raids on the coast of Britain at this time. Certainly not enough to warrant these massive fortresses. And so then you have these forts that continue to be either built or rebuilt or repaired into the late 3rd century, and 2 of which are still standing to a very impressive height at Portchester and Pevensey, and then the others stretching around all the way up to the north coast of Norfolk. They get their name from a single page of the Notitia Dignitatum, which is the western section and generally dated between 400 and 420, and it is the Saxon Shore, the Comes Litoris Per Sonicus, Saxonicus. And so that gets its name from the Saxon Shore. The problem with that is, of course, that by the time the Notitia Dignitatum is written, we are starting to talk about the abandonment of Britain, and that the Roman forces in Britain have begun to abandon the province entirely. Now, again, that's a debate as to when that happens. Some people say it happens in the late 4th century. Others say it happens in the early 5th century, so by 407 or 411. But we have the Notitia Dignitatum, which talks about a vast garrison of Roman forces with staying in Britain for some time beyond what we would say would be the abandonment of Britain. But at some point, these forts become united under a single commander in Britain, which is interesting because there are 2 other commanders in Britain by that the Notitia. There's a Comes Britannarum who has a whole series of forts, and a Dux Britanniarum who's got a whole series of units. So there's this 3 commanders, but by this point in time, of course, there's 5 provinces of Britain. So these 3 commands supersede the 5 provinces, which presumably have their own civil and administrative control, but there are these 3 military commands within Britain. And it's very hard to reconcile exactly when did raids occur to warrant a unified command against them. And some people would completely abandon that at ever existing at all, which is we've got one piece of evidence and we're basically going to reject our one piece of evidence, which is very tricky. But there seems to be a unified command. But then there's a problem that there are other fort sites that are not mentioned under the command. So, for instance, Walton Castle, which is now lost, taken by erosion, isn't mentioned as one of the Saxon Shore forts, but there was a fort there. We have illustrations from the 17th and 18th century showing us the remains of the fort, but it's not listed on the Notitia. So you're like, well, hang on, that's another fort. And then there are forts further around, some on the Isle of Wight, some near Southampton, and a whole series on the Welsh coast, which are built at the same time, built in the same way, but not mentioned as part of this system to defend Britain from Saxon raids. So are they a part of a different system that doesn't get mentioned? Are they part of a system that they'd been abandoned by the time that this command came into being? All of these are questions that academics have expended lots and lots of ink over, and there is no consensus. When they reject the idea that they were Saxon, there to defend against Saxon piracy, there are other theories that they're logistic centers, that they are centers to invade Europe from, which is one theory as well, or that they are, various different types of this is what they're actually doing. And it's an interesting issue in terms of trying to work out how would such a system work. By this point in time, of course, the Classis Britannica, the fleet has gone, or it's no longer called the Classis Britannica. So there may be remnants of a Roman fleet, but we don't know how it's organized. None of the garrisons are members of the fleet. They're vexallations of quite small units. So even though these forts are vast, they've only got 500 men manning them. So, and they're enormous forts that would be more than enough for a legion, but that's not the size of their garrison at all. So there's all sorts of unanswered questions. They pretty much go silent in the sources. We don't get anyone talking about them. There's a few later sources like Bede that talk about towers in the south. That's it. Towers and towers. Turres is the Latin, not the vast big fort things, just towers, which is very confusing. And then there's this one account of some battles fought at Anderetum, which is probably Pevensey, in 471, which is getting close to the end of ancient history during the Saxon invasions of England to create the
actual Saxon invasion. Yeah.
Yes, the Anglo-Saxons. Yes, exactly. So they're an amazing survival, because most of them have some form of very visible ruins. So Pevensey and Portchester are the best. Parts of the walls of Dover are still, and obviously the Dover Lighthouse is part of the system too. Lympne, which is the one that gets ignored, but is great. Richborough, Rutupii, Reculver, they're amazing survivals, and yet they're silent in the sources. So we've got these amazing archaeological remnants with rich finds of archaeology and dating material, which help with all sorts of periods of Roman British history, and yet the sources are absolutely silent on when, why, how, who built them.
And Ancient Warfare Magazine is here to clarify everything for us.
Well, unfortunately, probably just as usual, come up with more questions and
add some ink. We're here to add some ink.
Add some ink. Yeah, exactly. And well, I was going to add that there are also some similar forts or probable forts on the European coast across from the English Channel from the same time, and at least one of those, there is some evidence for some raiding, but that would be Germanic or Saxon coastal raiders who just basically come down their own coast instead of taking a rickety boat 300 kilometers across the North Sea.
Exactly. And I mean, the interesting thing about that is there's two commanders in what is now what was Belgica, but is now all within France. But the sites are actually less secure than the sites of the Saxon Shore, almost as if the sites that were the French forts have been reoccupied for such a long period that there's almost no remains of them. So when you look at the French sites, there's question marks after every suggested location. But they do have a similar sighting, which is also interesting with those forts in Wales. And so, for instance, there's an article in there by Andy Pearson on the fort at Cardiff, that all of these forts are sited on river estuaries or river mouths, major river mouths, and are therefore there to defend that river mouth from raiders, or in alternate versions, defend upriver or downriver from attacks from either side. So they've got similar rules of siting. They're generally all rectangular-esque, although there are some that merge more into oval. They've normally got, turrets on the corners. Some have other turrets in the curtain wall and defended gateways. So it's a really interesting set of forts. They're not all built to the same design, because they show some were built at different periods of time by a few decades when they first built. So they seem to be showing some form of evolution of design.
But to some degree, Murray, I'm thinking that there is Roman forts were always evolving and changing. I mean, it's amazing to me that we tend to think of Roman forts as being playing card shape. Well, really, that's a sort of Flavian development, isn't it? I mean, all the forts before that, if you look at Augustus and before, and then from Flavian, the Hadrianic period onwards, they start really becoming dependent on the topography of the area. So they will follow whatever contours there are. They'll be whatever shape they need to be. And in some circumstances, yes, they can be perfect squares with corner towers, but in lots of the places, the geography doesn't allow them to do that. Materials aren't available to be able to do that. They have to improvise.
The word evolution is in itself fairly a bad word to use here, because, as you're saying, Lindsay, on the one hand, there's not necessarily a natural evolution in terms of Roman fortification. There is also the banding round of different theories of how to fortify, what type of fortification, whether a turret should be attached to the main curtain wall or not. The pros and cons of that can be bandied around, and therefore looking at this and saying it's evolution is probably starting out on the wrong foot in terms of trying to date these forts.
No, fair point. Evolution is a word I came to like, and this is part of the problem that we have, isn't it? That we are looking for patterns, right? So, that we're looking for a creator that somehow is masterminding this whole thing. And I suspect it came down to the original Praefectus Castrorum to innovate something, and in fact, I could talk ad nauseum about the Augustan forts, and that's where you see that played out. So I have to imagine by the time you get to this period, 3rd and 4th century, the same factors.
The subject of our last talk is probably one of the big issues in that you have Hadrian's Wall, which is a single design. Even though they changed their mind, no, we'll make it thinner. There's that idea, the imposition of a single, and especially because they're called the Saxon Shore, because they're called a system in our single source, people see that therefore as a single overall design. But of course, that label comes very late. We don't know why they're lumped together. And as there are these other forts. So they've all been, for whatever reason, put together into a single command. But yes, each fort has a different history of construction under different people, and then repaired under different people. If they're built or rebuilt under Electus and Carausius, you're still not seeing the emperor, like with Hadrian's Wall, commanding or controlling that they're going to be built on the same plan. You've got a prefect castrorum probably in every case going, well, I'll do this and I'll do that and I'll do this. And, I've read my hygienist, I've read this, I've read that. I'm going to attach my turrets to the wall. No, I read some book that says don't, because then if the wall's breached, the turret's still, and you're like, okay. So I think in all those cases, you've got individuals controlling, the building of these things. But then, of course, they're all lumped together into a single unit, which to us, again, with our 19th century influence, want to see as a single design concept.
That lumping together comes, in part with the materials being used. They're all coastal and along the British coastline. We're all using similar materials and whatnot. There's a large amount of flint and beach pebble going into these fortifications. Everybody sees it, as the same pattern, unfortunately.
Except in Cardiff, where it's made of bricks and stones. I mean, there's not because there's no flint there. I mean, so it comes down to whatever's available.
I think that the siting of the forts is crucial to understanding what's going on, because by putting them at river mouths, they do two important things. One, they don't allow some sort of easy ingress into a river, which were the highways of the ancient world, which would have allowed raiders to move quickly deeper into the province. And also, once they had finished their raiding and were trying to get out with their loot, it would also have been a easy way out. So the siting of the forts at river mouths controlled that. And certainly, I think that if you had a handful of boats that could have patrolled somewhere in the areas of these forts or along the coasts, you could have caught raiders as they were coming along. So it was not a system of preclusive defense. That is, raiders could have just dragged their boats ashore and then marched inward, but it would have made it more difficult for them to abscond with whatever they had stolen and then get out again.
Are they all actually located at river mouths? I mean, if you take Reculver and you take Richborough, they are at either end of what was the Wonson, the channel that went between Kent and the Isle of Thanet when it was actually an island as such. It's more, that's not a river as such. That's more a byway as such. And
that's the River Stour, I think, is the one that they guard. There are towers too.
Well, okay,
yeah,
I'll give you that. But I'm sort of thinking that argues more in terms of it's not necessarily fully a military purpose that they're being placed for, but rather an economic. It's actually maintaining a thoroughfare rather than necessarily guarding the ins and outs.
Well, the annoying point is that you could say if you're going to put down a number of forts anywhere along a coastline, the only point that makes any kind of sense is along an estuary, because otherwise you might as well just disperse them at random distances from each other, and they might be useful. They're probably not useful at all. So if you know that any fort you're going to put on a coastal site is going to be in an estuary, what does that tell you then about its function?
Well, the Retupii remains the landing point in Britain from the first invasion. So, when St. Augustine lands in Britain in 587, right smack bang in the middle of the Dark Ages, it's at Retupii. And yet by that point, according to later evidence and archaeological evidence, the fort sites have been abandoned by this point for some time, and they're now being given over to monastic orders to build their monasteries within the grounds of the fort. So they're abandoned, and yet in some cases they still stand to 10, 14 meters of height. I wonder whether they're actually largely deterrents, as in there's a fort there, don't go near it. It's like, well, there's actually two guys with a spear between them who's actually guarding it. So, but you don't know that, because all you see is a giant, amazing fort, but you don't know that there's a garrison, a tiny garrison or no garrison at all.
And do you know what? It's interesting to make that comparison that Carnarvon Castle up in North Wales was designed to be manned by 19 armed men. 19. So these things can be designed with very small crews.
So I think that our understanding of how forts work and what a permanent garrison looks like and what its function is could be manned by a skeleton crew and still be an imposing statement on the landscape.
I want to take up Mark's theories, DeSantis, that is to say so, about the forts, in a sense, being estuary and river defences. And that's what I think Cardiff was. I think it has nothing to do at all with the Saxon Shore fort. And that's why it's not in this Notitia Dignitatum. I think what's significant, and one thing I would speculate and share this thought with me, is that around about 296, the province is subdivided into 4 administrative units. Right, and I think that is also tied up with the development of this. So, for example, Britannia Prima, and what's the other one? Is it? So Secunda is the one which is broadly Wales, and its capital, very significantly, is Glewlwm, which is Gloucester, which is right at the end of the Severn Estuary. And in fact, if you know your Severn Estuary, it has a tidal range of 15 meters. It's amazing. It goes up and down up there. And Cardiff is just on the edge where that tidal doesn't happen. In fact, it has a bay, and in fact, it actually has a body of water there permanently. If you build a fort further up the estuary, it basically is sludge. You can't actually operate anything from there for most of the day. So when, in fact, you go over the Severn Bridge, there are 2 of them, when you do it in the daytime, what you see is this vast sort of sandbank with trickles, rivulets, and then the water comes in. And you have the famous Seven Ball, which is where the water actually goes backwards. Which is quite impressive. So I think Cardiff Castle is part of an administration defence system. And it also ties in with the fact that Isca, which is the home of Legio Secunda, that at this point has effectively ceased to operate. And you can see it within that context. So, are there raids coming in from Ireland? I have to believe there are, because you've got Caergybi up in North Wales, up in Holyhead, which is a fortified military establishment, as far as we understand. Also, Carwent and Carmarthen, Moridunum, are also fortified with walls and towers at this point in time as well. So there is obviously a threat here. And part of the defence, in fact, is the estuary. And the jewel in the crown for raiders is Gloucester, which is the old sort of colonia up the river. And then how that relates to all of the other administrative centres, I can't tell you, but I think it's independent and different.
I think the interesting thing about the splitting of the provinces of Britain, is interesting because we do not know where they split or what they did. When they're split into 5 and then possibly 6, we have no idea where the lines were. And when you look at the reconstructions, they're like, here, you're like, well, that's very different to this one, who's placed all of the provinces in a different place, because we just don't know. And the interesting thing to me is that when you look at the splits, so Diocletian obviously makes the first split, and we don't know whether it's 4 or 6. There's 6 named in the Verona list, but only 4 that we think. And then there's a later split with the creation of the province of Valentia. They seem to all occur immediately after a breakaway by Carausius and Electius, and then by Magnus Maxentius, and then by Constantine III. So they seem to be punishments of Britain having split, and therefore we will split you. So, we're going to leave the empire, right? Well, we're going to cut you in half, or now we're going to divide you into 4, now we're going to divide you into 5. And I wonder whether the imposition of forts on there within Britain is a reaffirming of an attempt to reaffirm Roman control. That, as camps were always the imposition of Romanitas in the landscape. It was a very obvious reminder that the Roman army was present.
They predate the provinces.
Yes, but their reoccupation and strengthening of the and rebuilding seems to occupy these time periods as well.
Yeah, well, that is actually a thing that we haven't mentioned yet. That is worth considering the larger context that these forts get built in the 3rd century when there's usurpers popping up left and right, including across the Channel in 260, Postumus in his Gallic breakaway empire. And then Carausius in 286, who decides to have Britain for himself. So defenses against the Roman army coming back might even be an option.
Or on the other hand, administrative centres in terms of you sort of mentioning breakaway empires, but actually, each time there is sort of an element of Britannia and the elements of Gallia being joined together. So these are administrative centres on each side of the Channel, which could simply be a way of, adding cohesion to the two centres as such.
Considering that it's very difficult to have any control of the seas in the ancient world, it makes sense if you have the ports that most closely connect the two coasts under strong control.
Yeah, well, and then of course, there's the big issue that Bononia, Boulogne, is not a fort in the system, but it's the
probably
major.
Had one. But
well, it had a fort, but it's not mentioned in the Gallic Saxon Shore.
But it's more of a harbour, though, isn't it? In terms of a lot of the Saxon shore forts, they dominate, as you say, river estuaries and whatnot, but they're not full blown harbours, and they're probably how can I say, they're probably seeing more boat traffic that's pulling up on the coast as such, rather than necessitating a harbour like Bononia.
I think there's an argument that says they did have harbours, but the archaeology hasn't been decided. But Dover is definitely, Portchester is. They think that the Garionorum up in Caister-on-Sea probably had a fort as well. Probably had a harbour as well. So it's kind of like.
Is that the one up on Thanet?
It's Caister-on-Sea or Burr Castle.
How much do we think that the raids by whether it was Saxons or Frisians or anybody else coming down across the North Sea or through the Channel acted as a spur or some sort of goad towards the breakaway empires, first of Posthumus, and then you have Carausius too, and that the forts themselves are built as defensive structures for two purposes, that is, against the pirates, but also to hold the ports of this breakaway state, which we'll call Britain and Gaul. How much of that is trying to separate out whether it was the defenses against the Saxons or defenses against other Romans might be very difficult. What if it was both of them at the same time, reinforcing each other?
When Britain decides to break away, is always at times when the centralized Roman government isn't offering much in the way of support or leadership. So even the later breakaway empires, under Honorius and others, are always when there's either other civil wars happening and therefore Britain feels vulnerable. So that certainly is a possibility. It might also be they were never going to be particularly effective, but look, we're doing stuff. We're building forts.
Are you suggesting when Britons get a little bit antsy that they're being overlooked by a European power, they vote for Brexit?
But of course, it's also who they're looking to for leadership, and that idea that independence was something to be frowned upon, as opposed to centralized support from Rome.
But wasn't he presenting himself as Carausius et fratres sui, and it was he was among equals. So it was breakaway, but on a par.
But from his perspective. But from everyone else's perspective, no, you're a usurper. We're going to put you down.
Carausius was very much trying to portray himself as the embodiment of Romanness. That is, he had a breakaway Britannia, but he was not making it into something that was not Roman. It was just now is Britannia on its own.
Yeah, but it's all usurpers always, present wherever they are, whether it's in the far eastern reaches of the empire or the far north or wherever. If they claim the throne, they are, conceived from Rome itself, and they have concordia with the army, and they have, all the values that the emperor is supposed to be. That's just like standard. They have a checkbook when I'm going to usurp now. What should I be doing? Tick, 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 tick.
If I could also build upon this, Carausius was Posthumus's admiral. That is, he was in charge of the fleet elements in the Channel. And if you have someone in charge of the fleet elements, there must have been there for some sort of reason, a strong reason, which would suggest that they were there to defend against raiders, which I can't help but make some sort of link or analogy to the Vikings of several centuries later, that the Saxons may not have been as numerous, but somehow you have a very similar problem of defense against seaborne raiders, and that you have, starting from the 3rd century onwards, a real need to defend coastlines, via coastal forts or via small flotillas of craft that can intercept the raiders. And if we look at the same period in the 260s, let's say in the Black Sea, you have the Goths who had gotten boats and then were raiding deep into the Aegean and Mediterranean. So certainly seaborne piracy, seaborne raids had become a thing, especially once the military anarchy or crisis of the 3rd century had depleted Rome's defensive resources.
The problem is that we just don't have very much evidence for that happening. In that, there's in Tacitus, I think there's Gauci in the mid 1st century who possibly are raiding the English coast either by accident because they just lost their way and sailed across the North Sea, or on purpose. But there's not much afterward, as far as we know. I think, and it's a difficult era for our sources, and of course in the mid 3rd century. But that stuff is happening with the Goths is visible in various ways, and there's nothing here other than forts appear.
I think there are Saxon raids on the shores of both Britain and Gaul in the 360s, and Eutropius, who's our best evidence for Saxon raids, or our worst, depending on your view of Eutropius, he's writing in 369. So I wonder whether the contemporary rating influences what he says about what happens under Carausius. So that there is this evidence under, I don't remember which emperor it is, under Julian and then Jovian. And of course, under Julian, he brings resources from Britain to Germany and to his campaigns on the Rhine. So that leads to another theory that these are logistic centers to supply Europe rather than for Britain in itself.
So in that sense, then, it does point to some sort of strategic master command. There must be people, and Augustus and the Caesar, presumably, either working in tandem or at least with delegated authority in this, to come up with a plan. And if they're doing those sorts of things, they're conscientiously moving resources, and they are doing a calculus which says that makes that one vulnerable, but this one over here is more useful to us. So if you've got raids coming over the Rhine and going into Italy and so on, that clearly is an existential threat. Whereas if Britain's being hit, that's okay, we forget about it.
Yeah. And I mean, well, the other thing is when you get later usurpers, so Magnus Maximus and Constantine III, they both invade Europe. And, Maximus takes the entire Western Empire except for Italy. He assassinates Gratian and lets Valentinian III live. And then Constantine III does the same thing. They're taking Spain, they're invading Gaul, and then they get defeated. As centers of military power that you can move about and, invade other places with, you do have evidence of that right through until the early 5th century. So,
and not just in the case of usurpers, of course. I mean, there are constantly troops going. Now, they're just constantly troops going back and forth across the Channel. To reinforce armies wherever they're needed. And there's a very large garrison always in Britain, and that is used at any time.
And I think that's one of the other problems we've got with things like the Notitia, which give us, this is the garrison. You're like, yeah, when you wrote it, but next week they've been shipped off somewhere else and you've brought another unit in, and those guys didn't perform well, so they've been booted out and they've put another unit in instead, which again is odd because the continuity of the garrisons on Hadrian's Wall are much longer. We have evidence of a particular cohort manning a particular fort at Hadrian's Wall for a vast number of years, whereas it looks like in the southern forts that they're shifted about far more regularly.
How frustrating that we have so many questions and so few answers.
It's ancient history. This is what happens. We have a lot less evidence than we would like.
The other thing that's interesting is that the internal, there seems to be much less archaeology of the internal structures.
Well, most of it is evidence for wooden structures, not necessarily anything. It's limited to the moving things like bathhouses inside of the forts, and in some cases there is evidence for tanning. There's evidence for butchering, etc. It's not exactly your screaming at you military, the traditional military
barracks
installation,
yeah.
And you've also got where there is evidence you haven't got the traditional, more traditional, I'd say, Roman military layout of there being that the barracks are right up against the curtain walls, etc. And there you've got large spaces in the middle of the forts. So what they're actually doing there, and whether it's just in terms of, like you're saying, if there's one group moving through, being replaced on a regular basis, is it that they're giving themselves more, how can I say, more room for change in terms of who they're actually catering for within each fort?
And there's burials, within the forts as well, which probably suggests later occupation. But it's very perplexing, I think, as with so many things with them. And I think the other problem we've got, of course, is that we're at the end of the late Roman period. We've got Ammianus Marcellinus, and we've got snippets from other varied sources, but we're at the very end of the Roman period, and then we go into the Dark Ages, and these are smack bang wet there, and then we have the early medieval period, who are reaching back into the Dark Age to talk about the medieval period going forward. So you've got this kind of meeting of two dark worlds to create the Dark Age, right smack bang when we want information about these forts. And it's incredibly frustrating about what's going on. And of course, what that leads to in British history is all this mythological, this is where King Arthur occurs, the period where we have no information, is where, oh, look, it's this legendary king or warlord or whoever he was defending Britain from Saxon raids. And so all of that's really quite intriguing, because you've got, the later medieval sources that really don't do a lot of, or certainly not a lot of, accurate British history. And the Roman tradition, which has been brilliant and full, and then it stops. So there's sort of nothingness on either side, and we're filling in the middle.
What do you think of the significance of it simply being named the Saxon Shore, and there being a commander named Comes Latoris Saxonici, the Count of the Saxon Shore? Does that work as evidence of the reality and or importance of this command and the presumably the raids that they were there to defend against, the Saxons?
It depends on whether you're interpreting that as that they are named for being the focus of Saxon raids, or is it looking from a British perspective across the channel and saying these are the forts that face the Saxon direction?
I mean, we might have a Hibernian shore as well.
Well, and why not? Because in the sort of organized way that the Roman mentality works, if you go all the way back to Augustus, I mean, they talk about in terms of provincial armies. So there's the army of Germany and a Mauritania. So this, in a sense, is a logical extension. You actually you create a command which deals with a particular threat.
But I mean, and under the Notitia, virtually every commander is either a dux or a comes. So in a way, it's not any different from every other area of Britain.
But they are supposed to be slightly different, aren't they, in terms of their focus, the dux and the comes? Is it the dux is more military-centric rather than the comes? That's what I've taken in the past, that the comes is a little bit more administrative.
Yeah, the dux has more units under his command, and in comparison to the two comes in Britain. It's hard to know, though, because the Saxons, depending on, again, the interpretation of the evidence is very tricky, but it looks like the Saxons are being used as letus troops in the 4th century. So they are being brought in as, when does the Bucellarius start? So you've got the Bucellarius or the Bucellari under Honorius, but this idea that you have a private bodyguard that the general hires and equips and uses seems to be present earlier. And there certainly seem to be groups of Saxons raiding in the 370s, both in Gaul and in Britain, and that therefore they're available to be hired. So that's another, is the Saxon Shore Saxon settlement, for instance, which again mirrors what happens later in the 5th century with the Saxon invasions to carve out empires. But normally we say the reason for that is because by then Britain's been abandoned, and therefore the coast is vulnerable, and therefore you get the Kingdom of Anglia, the Kingdom of Kent, the Kingdom of Sussex, and then eventually Wessex and Mercia. You then get the idea, well, yes, but our best evidence for that is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So of course they're going to emphasize the Saxon and Anglo-Saxon aspect of it. That's another sort of spanner in the works, is that this could actually be a settlement rather than the title could be settlement rather than defense or attack.
Or it's where those mercenaries are used. That's
an interesting way to advertise your job. You just raid somewhere and like, look, you could also hire us. And
yeah, exactly. Look how effective we are.
I know that Constantine, the great Emperor Constantine, hired many Germanic soldiers for the Roman army, and one of the perceived benefits of hiring Germanic soldiers at that time was that if you brought them into the Roman army, they were not on the other side of the Rhine attacking the Roman Empire. So the idea of recruiting people from outside a state to defend it against other people of their similar origin is nothing new. That's just what they did.
Well, that seems to be what happens, of course, when Vortigern, again, when the Romans leave Britain, whenever that happens, British tyrants come to power, and he seems to hire Saxons, who then basically go, right, well, you either pay us more or we're going to take over. He can't pay them anymore, so they take over, which is, again, an age-old problem with mercenaries anyway. But it would almost seem as if the Saxon invasion, which is traditionally dated to 449, which is Hengst and Horsa, that they're actually originally hired by Vortigern to be a military force, and that then blows up in his face, which again is not emphasized in later sources, which is all about Saxon invasions, as opposed to, no, we let them in. We actually invited them here, gave them a fort as reward for their service, and then they betrayed us. How dare they? So it's
But it wouldn't be the first time that had happened in the Roman Empire. They were very trusting in silly ways sometimes.
And that danger of mercenaries, it was repeated time and again, going back centuries, where when mercenaries were recruited to defend a city, for instance, what they would quickly perceive is the weakness of the city. That is, the city, and the defense was delivered into their hands. So I'm thinking maybe the Mamertines, that is, once you have mercenaries where the defense of a locale is in their hands and they know all of the political problems and weaknesses of that particular locale, they can exploit those advantages for their own purposes.
On that bombshell, see you next month. Thank you all.